Picture an entire formation of fighter jets, 5 aircraft, all mid-exercise, all talking over each other on a crowded tactical frequency. The specific controlled chaos of pilots juggling a dozen things at once. And then picture every single one of those pilots going quiet at exactly the same moment, all because of 4 words spoken by someone half the squadron had spent the previous 2 weeks writing off as green, untested, a rookie who probably shouldn't even be flying in that formation yet. I've gone back and listened to the account of that morning more than once, and every single time I get to that moment and it still gives me chills. But to actually feel why those 4 words landed the way they did, you have to go back 2 weeks, to a young pilot walking into a squadron for the first time, carrying a reputation nobody there had any idea actually belonged to her. If you're the kind of person who loves watching quiet competence absolutely demolish a room full of confident assumptions, hit subscribe before we go any further, because this channel exists for exactly that feeling. And tonight, I want you playing along with me. At some point in this story, before I actually say her call sign out loud, you're going to start guessing what it means. When you get there, stop and drop it in the comments. I want to know exactly where in the story it clicked for you. Let's rewind 2 weeks, because you need to understand just how confidently wrong that squadron was before we get anywhere near that radio frequency. Her name, for tonight's story, was Second Lieutenant Casey Monroe, 24 years old, and on paper, everything about her arrival at that fighter squadron looked exactly like what everyone assumed it was. Fresh out of advanced flight training, youngest pilot in the room by a noticeable margin, first operational assignment. To the pilots already flying with that squadron, people with years of experience and a comfortable, well-worn hierarchy already in place, Casey looked like exactly what her file suggested on the surface. A rookie. Somebody who needed watching. Somebody who hadn't yet earned a real seat at the table. Somebody whose opinions in a briefing carried, by unspoken squadron consensus, considerably less weight than anyone who'd actually been flying combat exercises for more than a few months. I want to pause here and be fair to that squadron for a second. Because I don't think this story works if we paint every single person in it as some cartoon villain. Being cautious with a brand new pilot isn't unreasonable on its face. Experience matters in that world, genuinely, and a healthy skepticism toward an untested newcomer is, in most cases, just good sense. The problem wasn't that they were careful with her. The problem was how quickly careful turned into dismissive. How fast, "Let's see what she can do," turned into, "We already know what she can do," without anybody actually bothering to look closely enough to find out if that assumption was even true. Within her first week, Casey had already picked up the kind of treatment that doesn't announce itself as unkind, but adds up to something uncomfortably close to it anyway. Her questions in briefings got answered with slightly more explanation than anyone else's, the specific, subtle condescension of people assuming you need things spelled out. Flight assignments during training exercises tended to put her in more conservative, lower responsibility roles, even when her actual scores and evaluations suggested she was more than ready for something considerably more demanding. Nobody said any of this out loud, not directly. It just happened, quietly, consistently, the way institutional assumption usually does. Here's something I want you holding on to as we keep going tonight, because I think it's going to matter more than it sounds like it should right now. How often do you think we decide someone's ceiling before we've actually watched them try to reach it? Hold that thought. We're circling back to it. What none of those pilots knew, because it simply wasn't the kind of thing that shows up in a standard personnel file, and certainly wasn't anything Casey had volunteered in her first 2 weeks, was that her path to that cockpit had been considerably less conventional and considerably more demanding than the tidy, standard-issue story everyone had assumed about her. Before formally entering flight training, Casey had spent 3 years in a specialized aviation cadet program built around exactly the kind of accelerated, intensive tactical instruction that most pilots her age simply never encounter. A program specifically designed to identify and fast-track a small handful of candidates whose natural aptitude for split-second tactical decision-making outpaced what standard training timelines could measure. She'd completed that program with evaluation scores that her instructors, in private assessments that never made their way into casual conversation, had described as some of the highest they'd recorded in nearly a decade. And during the final phase of that program, in a live, deliberately grueling multi-aircraft training scenario designed to simulate exactly the kind of chaotic, high-pressure coordination a real combat engagement demands, Casey had done something that had, without her ever asking for it, earned her a call sign among the small, specific community of instructors and fellow cadets who'd witnessed it firsthand. The scenario that day had gone sideways in a way the instructors hadn't fully planned for. A genuine communication breakdown between multiple aircraft, compounded by a realistic simulated equipment failure, the kind of layered chaos that tests not just flying skill, but the ability to think clearly when everything around you is falling apart at once. While two more experienced cadets in that same exercise struggled visibly to keep their composure as the scenario compounded, Casey had done something that several witnesses specifically remembered word for word. She'd taken over coordination of the entire formation herself, without waiting for permission, issuing clear, precise instructions to aircraft that weren't even technically under her command, and had done it with a calm, controlled authority that instructors reviewing the exercise afterward said made her sound, in the words of one, like someone who'd been doing this for 20 years, not 20 months. The name that stuck to her after that day wasn't dramatic on the surface, but among the people who understood exactly what it referenced, it carried real weight. They called her Warden, because in the middle of genuine chaos, she hadn't just survived it, she'd taken control of it, quietly, completely, the way someone in charge of keeping order does when everything around them threatens to fall apart. None of that traveled with her into her new squadron. All anyone there saw was a young pilot with a thin operational record, and in the absence of any louder story to attach to her, Rookie became the entire story they settled on. For 2 weeks, Casey absorbed that quiet underestimation without pushing back on it directly, flying her assigned training sorties with the same understated competence she'd apparently brought to everything in her career so far, letting the small, grinding condescension roll past her without giving anyone the satisfaction of a visible reaction. According to two fellow pilots who served alongside her during that stretch, her composure through all of it was, if anything, almost unsettling in how completely unbothered she seemed, the specific, quiet confidence of someone who already knows exactly what she's capable of and simply doesn't feel the need to prove it to a room that hasn't earned the explanation yet. That brings us to the exercise that changed everything. The training scenario that morning involved a large, coordinated formation exercise, 5 fighter aircraft working together through a complex simulated engagement designed to test exactly the kind of multi-aircraft coordination under pressure that separates a genuinely sharp squadron from an average one. Casey, true to the pattern of her first 2 weeks, had been assigned a conservative, lower responsibility position within the formation, well back from anything resembling a leadership role, exactly where the squadron's existing assumptions about her had quietly placed her. About 18 minutes into the exercise, the scenario escalated in a way the formation hadn't fully rehearsed for. A genuine, unplanned complication emerged, a real communication issue affecting the formation's lead aircraft, compounded by the simulated threat environment growing considerably more aggressive than the morning's briefing had prepared anyone to handle smoothly. The formation's designated leader, dealing with a degraded radio connection and a rapidly compounding tactical picture, started losing the kind of clean, coordinated control that a five-aircraft formation absolutely needs to function safely, and over the shared tactical frequency, the chatter between the other four aircraft began fraying into exactly the kind of overlapping, urgent confusion that, in a real engagement, gets people hurt. For a few genuinely tense seconds, according to the exercise's flight recordings reviewed afterward, that formation was on the verge of losing coherent coordination entirely, multiple pilots talking over each other, nobody quite able to re-establish the clear chain of communication the scenario demanded. And then, over that same crowded frequency, a voice cut through, calm, immediate, carrying an authority that hadn't been there in any of Casey's radio traffic over the previous 2 weeks. "This is Warden. I have the formation. Everyone hold your position and listen. I want you to really sit in that moment with me, because the account of what happened next is, honestly, one of my favorite details in any story I've told on this channel." According to 3 pilots who were part of that formation, the entire frequency went almost instantly silent, the specific silence of multiple experienced people simultaneously recognizing a name that meant something considerably more significant than anyone in that squadron had any reason to expect from the pilot they'd been quietly dismissing for 2 weeks. A couple of those pilots, it turned out, had heard the name Warden before, secondhand, through instructors or fellow pilots who'd come up through adjacent training pipelines, the kind of reputation that travels quietly through a very specific professional grapevine long before it ever announces itself directly. Casey, in that same calm, unhurried voice, took over coordination of the entire formation, issuing clear, specific instructions that re-established order within seconds, repositioning aircraft, restoring a coherent tactical picture, and effectively rescuing an exercise that had been genuinely at risk of falling apart entirely. She did it with exactly the same unshaken authority that had earned her that call sign years earlier, and over the following several minutes, the formation, under her direction, completed the remainder of the exercise with a level of coordination that the evaluators monitoring it afterward specifically flagged as considerably sharper than the formation's performance had been even before the complications started. Back on the ground, once the exercise wrapped and the formation returned, the mood in that squadron's debrief room, according to 2 people present, had shifted into something considerably different from the casual, slightly dismissive atmosphere that had surrounded Casey for her first 2 weeks. Pilots who'd barely acknowledged her outside of required interaction were now asking directly where exactly that call sign had come from, and Casey, without much fanfare, gave them a brief, understated account of the program she'd come through, clearly more interested in moving on to the actual debrief than in dwelling on the reveal. The squadron's senior pilot, a man who had, by his own later admission, been among the more visibly skeptical voices about Casey's readiness over those first 2 weeks, reportedly pulled her aside after the debrief and told her plainly that he'd misjudged her, and that he intended to make sure her actual capabilities were reflected in how the squadron used her going forward, rather than continuing to slot her into roles that had never actually matched what she was capable of. In the weeks that followed, Casey's position within that squadron shifted noticeably. The conservative, lower responsibility assignments stopped. The subtle over-explanation in briefings stopped. What replaced it wasn't loud celebration or constant reference to what had happened that morning, but something quieter and, in its own way, more meaningful. The specific, hard-earned respect that comes from a room finally seeing someone clearly, rather than through the assumption they'd walked in with. What stays with me most about this story isn't really the moment that frequency went silent, satisfying as it undeniably is. It's the 2 weeks before it, 2 weeks of a genuinely exceptional young pilot absorbing small, persistent underestimation from people who had decided, almost entirely from a thin personnel file and an unremarkable first impression, that they already understood the shape of her ceiling. She never once tried to correct that assumption directly. She just kept doing her job, quietly, competently, and let her work carry the exact weight it had always carried, right up until the moment the entire squadron needed exactly what she'd been all along, whether they'd bothered to notice it or not. So here's my question for you tonight, and I want your honest answer in the comments. Do you think squadrons and teams in general are actually getting better at not underestimating newcomers based on thin first impressions? Or do you think it's simply human nature to build a story about someone fast and then stop looking closely enough to update it? And tell me the other thing too. Before that frequency went silent, had you already started suspecting that this rookie was carrying a reputation nobody in that room actually understood yet? If this story kept you here tonight, subscribe before you go, because this channel exists entirely for exactly this kind of story. The quiet ones, the underestimated ones, the ones who let a whole room stay wrong about them right up until the moment it truly matters. And if you've got a story like Casey's, something you've lived through or heard that reminds you of this one, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight. I'll see you in the next one.